Greetings to all our viewers tuning into our channel. If this is your first time with us, please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the stories that are shaping the global economic and political landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, when Washington officially raised the anti-dumping tariff on Canadian softwood lumber from 20.56% to 35%, it was as if the United States had fired a shot into its own supply chain. This was no longer just a dry administrative notice. It was a thunderclap echoing through the forests of Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta, where hundreds of thousands of people depend on each plank, each log shipped down south for their livelihood. To American politicians, this was a move to protect domestic industry. But in the eyes of thousands of construction workers in Texas, Florida, or California, it marked the beginning of a materials nightmare. Because Canadian lumber is the backbone of the U.S. construction industry, from residential rooftops to roads and schools. Without it, every blueprint is just another blank sheet of paper. The moment the new tariff was announced, the market trembled. Lumber exchanges in Chicago and Vancouver surged simultaneously. American businesses scrambled to snatch up the remaining shipments, while small contractors had to halt new contracts because they couldn't estimate costs. North of the border, the reaction was just as fierce. Canadian media called it a disguised punishment, and politicians accused Washington of weaponizing economics for political ends. In truth, the U.S. simply can't meet its massive lumber demand on its own. For every 3 boards used to build a house in America, 1 comes from Canada. That's why when the Trump administration decided to ramp up pressure, many saw it as nothing short of a stray bullet, one that hit the U.S. economy itself. Behind that decision lies an obsession called protectionism, a resurging belief in Washington that America can only grow stronger by shutting its doors, by erecting tariff walls to shield its domestic workers. But in today's interwoven world, cutting even one strand can shake the entire web. Lumber mills in Canada falter, while construction sites in the U.S. grind to a halt. Everyone is dragged into a spiral where no one wins. Some analysts believe this move targets more than just lumber. It's also a warning shot to Ottawa after a series of trade disputes over steel, aluminum, and energy. Washington wants to prove it still has the power to strike at will, and that Canada, the seemingly close neighbor, will have to play by the rules of the giant to the south. But what they didn't expect was the quiet resistance brewing. Because for Canada, and especially for Ontario, the country's industrial and lumber exporting heart, this is no longer just a trade issue. It's a matter of pride, of sovereignty, of whether a nation will forever accept being just a supplier of raw materials to its wealthy neighbor. While U.S. media were still dissecting the new tariffs, leaders in Ontario were already quietly discussing a move that would leave Washington stunned. A response not in words, but in action, strong enough to shake the entire North American market. And then, just days later, that response came. Ontario announced it would halt lumber exports to the U.S., a decision that seemed reckless, but opened a new chapter in a standoff the world would later remember as the North American Lumber War. Canada's response came swiftly and coldly, like a blade slicing through the lifeline of the American economy. Ontario, the country's largest industrial hub, announced an immediate halt to all lumber exports to the United States. No warning, no negotiation. Just one stark sentence from the Premier of Ontario was enough to send shockwaves through North America's financial system. If Washington chooses a trade war, we are prepared to pay the price to protect our dignity. A single statement, yet its echoes rippled out like seismic tremors. Nearly 1/3 of America's construction lumber, equivalent to 28 million cubic meters annually, vanished overnight. These weren't just shipments of wood. They represented hundreds of thousands of jobs, half-built dreams of homeownership, and the trust in a market once considered the most stable in the world. In the days that followed, rail lines that once carried lumber across the border fell silent. At staging yards near the Great Lakes, cranes sat idle, workers in reflective vests perched on pallets, smoking in silence, eyes heavy with uncertainty. South of the border, American contractors began to realize the nightmare unfolding. Dwindling materials, delayed contracts, and bids rising by the hour. In Florida, A residential construction company announced a full pause on all projects for the upcoming quarter due to an inability to source lumber. In Texas, hundreds of workers were placed on temporary leave, and in California, home prices jumped 8% in just 2 weeks. A $250,000 home could now cost $270,000, all because the flow of wood from the north had stopped. In Congress, finger-pointing began. Some lawmakers defended the tariffs, claiming, "We must stand firm to ensure Canada plays fair." The opposition fired back. What fairness is there in cutting off our own lifeline? The arguments only highlighted a bitter irony. While the US was tripping over itself, Canada, despite short-term pain, was winning the sympathy of the international community. In Ottawa, journalists described Ontario's move as a symbolic punch. It wasn't just a protest against tariffs, it was a declaration that Canada had grown up, no longer content with playing second fiddle in a relationship shaped over centuries. Lumber businesses pivoted to European and Asian markets, where they were welcomed with fresh trade agreements, better prices, and fewer political strings attached. Domestic investment rose, processing plants expanded to produce more value-added goods. But behind the smiles and handshakes shown in the media, Ontario knew it was entering dangerous territory. Cutting off exports to the US could leave dozens of mills with excess capacity. Small businesses scrambled to adapt, shifting to furniture production, plywood, even investing in advanced processing technologies to retain their workforce. And yet, rather than panic, Canadians displayed rare unity. They saw this as a battle for honor, a stand to tell Washington that Canada would no longer be treated as a default supplier. Meanwhile, the first tremors of crisis began spreading south. US-led contractors rushed to buy up any remaining stock, driving prices to historic highs. On the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, lumber futures surged nearly 40% in just 1 week. The financial world dubbed it the greatest price storm since the pandemic. And all eyes turned to the White House, where Washington now faced the daunting question: can America truly produce enough wood to build its dreams, or must it crawl back to reclaim the supply it cast aside? The heat of this standoff crept into every street, every home. Ordinary Americans began to feel the fallout through skyrocketing material costs and homes once within reach slipping further away. The media called it the roof crisis, while experts warned if this dragged on, the housing market could spiral. Rising prices, falling demand, stalled construction, a perfect recipe for recession. And soon, the fear became reality. From New York to San Francisco, the numbers started to climb in unison. Lumber prices, housing costs, interest rates, unemployment. It was a clear signal the American economy was shaking to its core, not because of a financial meltdown, but because of something deceptively simple: wood. The quake from Ontario didn't just sever trade, it unleashed a cascade of consequences that couldn't be reversed. And as the sound of saws went silent along the border, a deeper sound emerged: the collective sigh of American cities. At this point, the lumber war was no longer just a story between two nations. It had become a spreading crisis, where every brick, every plank bore witness to the cost of a misguided policy. And it was then that America began to understand. Every tariff wall, no matter how well-intended as protection, can also become the grave of the very economy it was built to defend. When Ontario closed its forests, the US housing market trembled, marking the start of a new chapter in a crisis no one saw coming. Just hours after Ontario's announcement, the US lumber market plunged into a nightmare. On trading floors, lumber futures skyrocketed to levels not seen since 2021. Numbers flashed rapidly across screens like blades cutting through every sector. Construction companies, banks, investors, and ordinary citizens. A standard 2x4 board, the most basic building material, surged from $400 to over $650 per thousand board feet in just 3 days. For contractors, it was a disaster. For families dreaming of their first home, it was a financial nightmare. In the suburbs of Houston, a young couple who had just placed a deposit on their first house was forced to cancel the contract. The husband, in tears on local TV, said, "We saved for 5 years to make the down payment, but now just the material costs alone have gone up by $25,000. Our dream has turned to sawdust." In California, affordable housing projects were suspended due to budget shortfalls. In Washington state, dozens of school renovation projects had to be paused. Lumber, once seen as simple and cheap, had become the reason why millions of life plans were falling apart. Commercial banks responded immediately, tightening mortgage lending over fears of a growing housing bubble. The Federal Reserve faced a painful dilemma. Lowering interest rates to support construction would risk fueling inflation, but keeping them steady would only drive home prices higher as material costs surged. Some experts called it the perfect storm, where every variable pushed the economy further into uncertainty. In newly developed neighborhoods in Nevada and Florida, the sounds of hammers, saws, and concrete mixers suddenly stopped. Workers left job sites, and skeletal house frames stood exposed to the wind and sun, monuments to forgotten dreams. A quiet sense of despair crept into American households. People couldn't understand how a single decision in Washington had thrown their lives into disarray. Major publications like the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg began using the term wood shock to describe the situation. It wasn't just construction-grade lumber. The furniture industry, paper manufacturing, and packaging sectors were all hit in a chain reaction. Prices for tables, kitchen cabinets, and hardwood floors all climbed. American consumers, long used to cheap and plentiful goods, were now facing a stark new reality. They were living in an economy that could be paralyzed by the break of a single supply link. Meanwhile, politicians in Washington were still locked in televised debates. Some accused Canada of playing politics, while others blamed the administration for lacking strategic vision. But no matter the argument, Americans were waking up to one undeniable truth. The trade war was no longer a theory. It was knocking on every front door. A powerful economy was now trembling, all because it lacked the lumber to frame its homes. From New York to Chicago, real estate firms warned that if the situation didn't cool within 2 months, average home prices could jump by another 15%. That would put homeownership out of reach for millions of young Americans for the next decade. A J.P. Morgan analyst remarked, "We're witnessing a smaller-scale version of the 2008 crisis. But this time, the culprit isn't the banks. It's trade policy." The disruption spread faster than anyone had anticipated. Supply chains that had functioned smoothly for decades were now jammed by hundreds of new tariff clauses, heightened shipment inspections, and a growing fear enveloping the entire construction sector. Small businesses, already operating on razor-thin margins, were being pushed to the brink of collapse. And while the U.S. struggled to cope, Canada began to show something else. In every crisis, the one who controls the resource is the one who holds the final say. While Washington scrambled for a solution, Ottawa moved quietly. There were no media outbursts, no noisy press briefings, just quiet, decisive action. Canada began restructuring its entire lumber supply chain. Processing plants ramped up operations. The government promoted exports of higher-value wood products to Europe and Asia. Canada wasn't just retaliating, it was turning a crisis into an opportunity. And that's when the story began to outgrow the lumber dispute, stepping into deeper territory. A story of power, autonomy, and the question of who truly holds the balance in the North American relationship. To understand why Canada chose the path of confrontation, we have to look beyond the trade figures and the stacks of lumber loaded onto rail cars. Because behind every board, every exported log, lies a story of pride and the right to control one's own economic destiny. For years, Washington has played the role of big brother in the North American relationship, the rule maker, while Ottawa and Mexico were expected to follow. But as the world entered an era of supply chain crises, Canada slowly came to a realization. Only by taking control of what it owns can it stand as an equal, rather than remain in America's shadow. This wasn't the first time Canada had been backed into a corner. Over the past decade, its key exports, from steel and aluminum to energy, had repeatedly been hit with tariffs or import restrictions from Washington. The reasoning was always the same: to protect American industry. But in Ottawa, it was clear this wasn't just about protectionism. It was about power, a form of soft power hidden within trade agreements that kept smaller nations constantly on edge. And this time, when the blow landed on lumber, a traditional lifeline, Canada decided it would no longer stay silent. Ontario, the industrial heart of the country, understood that continuing to sell raw materials would only keep it at the bottom of the value chain. So, in the midst of crisis, a new policy direction was born. Instead of exporting raw logs, Canada would invest heavily in deep processing, from dimensional lumber and plywood to fully finished furniture. Factories in Thunder Bay, Sudbury, and Windsor were upgraded to produce high-end wood products, targeting markets like Europe, Japan, and South Korea. Buyers willing to pay more and negotiate with greater respect. This shift not only reduced dependency on the US market, it opened a new chapter for Canada, transitioning from a resource exporter to a sustainable manufacturing power. Ottawa no longer wanted to be just a supplier, it wanted to be a standard setter. And with each step forward, Canada sent a clear message. We're no longer afraid of losing the US market because we're building markets of our own. While Washington scrambled to justify its America First policy amid growing public frustration, Canada quietly won the respect of the international community. No loud condemnations, no fiery speeches, just action. Investments in wood recycling technology, clean manufacturing, and emissions reduction. Every move from Ottawa reinforced a simple truth. Real strength isn't about who can slap on the highest tariffs, it's about who can still stand when the storm has passed. And indeed, just a few months later, the balance began to shift. US lumber prices remained sky high, the housing market stagnated, while Canada welcomed a wave of new investments from Europe and Asia. Japanese construction giants signed long-term supply deals with Canadian producers. Germany and the Netherlands proposed collaborations in green building materials. The old image of Ottawa as the dependent little brother was fading. Canada had become a symbol of a nation willing to fight for control of its future. In Washington, some lawmakers began to worry that the tariff strategy was backfiring. While intended to protect domestic manufacturing, US contractors were now forced to import materials from Europe, often at higher prices than Canadian wood ever was. And those who once believed in the slogan, "Make America Great Again," were beginning to face a bitter truth. You can't be great if you sever the economic lifelines that sustain you. Analysts began calling it Canada's sovereignty pivot, a moment when a smaller nation rebuilt its development model to escape the shadow of its superpower neighbor. Canada had come to understand that power doesn't just come from military or financial strength, but from the ability to control supply chains, to set your own prices, and to refuse to be leveraged by a tariff line. This transformation didn't just confuse Washington, it forced the world to take notice. For the first time in decades, cracks were beginning to show in North America, long considered the planet's most stable economic bloc. One side had chosen protectionism, the other innovation. One built walls, the other opened doors. And as those paths diverged, the global economic order began to shift in unexpected ways. From Europe to Asia, governments were watching this standoff with intense interest. They understood that when the two largest economies in North America collide, new opportunities arise for those patient enough to wait. And in that moment, the world's eyes turned toward Canada. No longer just a casualty of a trade war, but a bold new player on the global economic stage. When the two most interconnected economies in the world began turning their backs on each other, the rest of the globe shifted its gaze. North America, once the gold standard of cross-border trade cooperation, had become a symbol of fracture, torn between pride and self-interest. On one side, Washington isolated itself with tariff walls and protectionist slogans. On the other, Ottawa quietly opened its doors to new partners from Europe, Asia, and South America. And the world, watching closely, moved swiftly to seize the opportunities created by this rupture. In Tokyo, major Japanese construction corporations wasted no time signing long-term agreements with Canadian lumber firms, securing a stable supply chain for at least the next decade. South Korea followed suit, launching a joint initiative in smart wood processing technologies aimed at doubling the value of Canadian exports. In Berlin and Stockholm, European investors began channeling capital into renewable materials, positioning Canada as a new green manufacturing hub for the West. Each cubic meter of lumber was no longer just a commodity. It was a symbol of reliability and trust, something Washington was slowly losing. Meanwhile, in South America, Brazil and Chile, once considered natural competitors of Canada in the lumber trade, saw a window of opportunity. As the US faltered, they moved in to fill the gap. Containers from the port of Valparaiso began arriving in Los Angeles and Houston, though the volume was still a fraction of what Canada once supplied. Everyone understood. America could buy wood from many places, but none could match Canada in scale, quality, and above all, trust. Multinational corporations watched with caution. They knew the fragmentation of the North American bloc could give rise to new supply chains, and that whoever moved first could shape the future of global trade. Companies from Germany, Japan, and India began opening offices in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, seeing these cities as new gateways to the Western market, free from the political risk now associated with Washington. Canada was no longer just a land of resources. It had become a land of opportunity, valued not just for its timber but for its stability, transparency, and open-handed diplomacy. From across the Pacific, China watched intently. Beijing understood that while Washington was entangled in its own trade wars, it could quietly expand its influence across Latin America, Africa, even the Arctic, where Canada was emerging as a rising climate power. India, racing through its industrial boom, began negotiations to import Canadian lumber for housing developments that would serve its 1.4 billion citizens. A new global picture was forming. As America retreated, the world expanded. As Washington built walls, the rest of the world found ways to build bridges. Ironically, the rift made Canada more trustworthy than ever. No longer viewed as America's economic shadow, it had become an autonomous center, proving the power of long-term vision. While the U.S. drowned in partisan infighting, Ottawa was praised for its calm, principled, yet flexible approach, open to dialogue with anyone, so long as it was rooted in mutual respect. And so, within less than a year, the balance of power in the region had shifted. The U.S., once the gravitational center of trade, was slowly isolating itself through its own policies. Meanwhile, Canada, by turning crisis into momentum, was being embraced as a trusted partner in the era of global supply chain reconstruction. Experts began calling it the North American paradox, where a superpower stumbles under the weight of protectionism, while a smaller nation rises by embracing openness. Yet beneath the charts and surging investment figures, a deeper question was taking shape. Are we witnessing a true global shift? One where trust and transparency become the new strategic currencies, overtaking military and monetary might? If so, then this lumber conflict is no longer just an economic story. It is a prototype for the future, one where those who uphold their word will ultimately rule the market. And from here, the lessons, both economic and political, are becoming unmistakably clear. What began as a seemingly narrow dispute over timber has become a mirror for the world, forcing us to rethink power, dependence, and the true value of trust in global commerce. Because sometimes, the cracks between two neighbors reveal truths meant for all of humanity. From what seemed like a mere technical figure in a ledger, a tariff adjustment, the world has now witnessed a cascading chain reaction that shook the very foundation of North American trade. But more telling than the economic shockwaves are the lessons left behind by the lumber war, not just for Canada and the United States, but for an entire world increasingly caught in the undertow of protectionism. The first and most obvious lesson: in the era of globalization, no nation can grow stronger by isolating itself. The United States, in its pursuit of economic self-reliance, built tariff walls to protect domestic manufacturing. But those walls, instead of shielding the economy, became a prison of its own making. When Washington raised tariffs, it believed it could pressure Canada into submission. Instead, it triggered the collapse of a deeply interwoven supply chain that had held together for over half a century. And once the first link snapped, the entire machine began to seize. From housing projects to processing plants, banks to insurance, every sector felt the ripple effects. A policy branded as patriotic ended up costing jobs, inflating housing prices, and pushing the dream of homeownership further out of reach. This irony reveals a hard truth. Real strength doesn't lie in building walls, but in keeping economic bridges open. The second lesson is the value of trust in trade. Canada didn't need weapons or threats. It made just one decision: to stop supplying lumber, and the world's largest economy wobbled. Because in every supply chain, the most crucial element isn't volume or capacity, it's the trust that the flow of goods won't be broken. When that trust is gone, currency, contracts, even political leverage become fragile. And in this battle, it was the smaller country that held that trust. The third lesson: the lumber war exposed Canada's quiet transformation from dependent junior partner to an independent player. Canada didn't respond emotionally, but strategically, by investing in clean production, value-added processing, and diverse trade partnerships. While Washington doubled down on America first, Ottawa quietly built a new identity: Canada, reliable. The stature of a nation isn't defined by the size of its territory, but by how it behaves when tested. From there emerges the fourth lesson: that crisis, if approached wisely, can become a springboard for renewal. Canada used the shock of U.S. tariffs as a catalyst to restructure its entire lumber industry and elevate its role on the global stage. They proved that when cornered, a nation has two choices: to shrink in defense or to rise and redefine its position. Canada chose the latter, the harder path, but the path of resilience. Meanwhile, the United States, once the poster child of free trade, now faces one of the defining questions of our era: can power be sustained through fear and coercion? Because a true superpower isn't one that can force others into obedience, it's one that inspires others to willingly collaborate. When trust is replaced by command, consensus disappears. And that is exactly what has unfolded in the Washington-Ottawa relationship. Ultimately, the lumber war offers a lesson that extends far beyond North America. In today's world, the most valuable resource isn't oil or rare earth metals or gold, it's trust and stability. Whoever controls that controls the future. Wood was merely a symbol. Behind it lies a philosophy of how a nation should face crisis. Not by reacting in fear, but by acting with vision. Looking back, it's clear, the lumber war was never really about lumber. It was about power, dignity, and a test of trust between two nations once considered brothers. One chose to raise tariffs to assert strength, the other stood firm to prove its worth. And in the end, the one that earned the world's respect wasn't the louder voice, but the calmer one. Today, the forests of Ontario are still green. Shipments of Canadian lumber continue to depart for Europe and Asia, and in the US, families are still grappling with soaring housing costs. But beyond the numbers and charts, this conflict has become a vivid parable of the age we live in, where economics is no longer just about money, but about morality, trust, and vision. And from within that crisis, a clear message emerges. True power doesn't come from imposing your will, but from earning trust, because only when a nation is trusted can it truly stand firm in any storm. Ladies and gentlemen, the lumber war between the US and Canada may seem like just a small fragment in the vast canvas of the global economy, but it reflects with startling clarity the true nature of the era we live in, an age where material, politics, and trust intertwine like the grain of a tree, strong yet fragile. These seemingly ordinary planks of wood have become a symbol of shifting power, when a smaller nation dares to say no to imposition, and a superpower is forced to reflect on how it treats the world around it. Wood, the very material that builds our homes, bridges, classrooms, and hospitals, has now become the weapon of a war without bullets. This wasn't a battle fought on the front lines, but in boardrooms, in trade agreements, in policy decisions. And every time a country chooses to protect itself by erecting tariff walls, it risks shaking the foundations of trust that took decades to build. The lumber war has proven one thing. In a globalized world, true strength isn't measured by how much you possess, but by how long others are willing to trust you. Canada didn't win through retaliation, but through calm resolve and long-term vision. They didn't use threats, but action, demonstrating that in trade, integrity and consistency are worth more than sheer power. They turned a crisis into a launchpad to redefine their role on the global stage. Meanwhile, the US, once the champion of free trade, is now paying the price for the very walls it built. As tariff barriers rise, trust falls. And when trust collapses, no economy, no matter how vast, is immune from the fallout. Ladies and gentlemen, this story leaves us with a powerful yet simple truth. Trust is the greatest asset a nation can have. It can't be printed in a mint or measured in dollars, but it can build or break empires. A country may lack resources, manpower, or capital, but if it retains the trust of its people and its partners, it can still rise and move forward. But when trust is lost, even a vault full of gold leaves you with nothing but isolation. The lumber war may be over, but its echoes still resonate. It reminds us that in today's volatile world, kindness, honesty, and steadfastness are strategic resources, ones no nation can steal and none can afford to lose. And perhaps the most powerful weapon isn't found in an arsenal, but in the hearts of those who choose to keep their word, no matter the cost. If today's story sparked something in you, a thought, a feeling, a shift in how you see the world, we invite you to share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can continue this journey together, uncovering the stories, quietly shaping our times. Because who knows? Your comment might just be the missing piece in the global puzzle we're all trying to complete together.